to start with a song called John and Jesus by Peter Carney.
Of John and Jesus, the rise and the fall. John was the prophet, the greatest of all, and Jesus, the Saviour whom God did send. They had the same message and came to the same sudden end. John kept to basics in food and in dress. He made his home out in the wilderness, and the down and the out were his neighbors there. He showed us a way when we didn't know where to begin. He said, come on everyone to the river to drown, to be tumbled and tossed and upside down. Change your heart, come clear your mind, and find your feet on new ground. One day the Pharisees came from the town, smooth-talking men in their fancy gowns. And John, he said, you're a brood of snakes. You know every law, but not what it takes to be good. He spoke without fear, and news of him spread. The poor, like children, came to hear what he said. He wasn't giving them stones, he gave them bread. They fed on the truth, every word that he said it all. He said, come on everyone to the river to drown, to be tumbled and tossed and upside down. Change your heart, come clear your mind, and find your feet on new ground. John gave a warning, destruction is due. The people asked him, just what should we do? If you've got two coats, then one is to share. If you have power, be sure you are fair to the poor. You know that Jesus, when he came along, he went straight to the river to be baptized by John. He took his place where John took his stand, brought news of a kingdom where the poor of the land could belong. They said, come on everyone to the river to drown, to be tumbled and tossed and upside down. Change your heart, come clear your mind, and find your feet on your ground. Old Herod the king, he liked to hear John speak. What he said made him nervous, but he sure was unique. Then John criticized his plans to re-wed, so they put him in prison. Before very long, John was dead. And how many people since Jesus and John spoke out the truth and soon were gone? After naming the names of the snakes in the pile, they're gone. But just for a while, they said, come on everyone to the river to drown, to be tumbled and tossed and upside down. Change your heart, come clear your mind, and find your feet on your ground.
What did you go to the desert to see? Was it a reed shaking in the breeze?
Oh no, it was a wiry tree, growing up strong in a place where a tree shouldn't be. They said, come on everyone to the river to drown, to be tumbled and tossed and upside down. Change your heart, come clear your mind, and find your feet on your ground.
Come on everyone to the river to drown, to be tumbled and tossed and upside down. Change your heart, come clear your mind, and find your feet on your ground.
And to start a prayer, and it goes, Hineni, here I am. Hineni, here I am, with you still. Hineni, here I am, trusting you. O Lord, in thee have I trusted. Let me never be confounded. And that's from the Book of Common Prayer in the Episcopalian Church. And first, a story. Last year, coming up to Christmas, I came out of Coles in Alice Springs and it was extremely hot, and I saw a snake slowly dying. And I've seen older kids around here carrying snakes around in backpacks, so my guess is that one did that and dropped it there. It was already hurt, its guts were out, and it was writhing on the hot pavement, heading away from Coles across a busy road with an endless stream of cars. And it was hopeless. Even if it had made it across that road, there were 2 rows of parked cars then, and then another busy road, and then concrete, and then shops, and then a main road, and then a shopping centre. And so there was nowhere for it to go. And as it struggled, a car would come along and it would get run over and carried a little way along, and then it would writhe some more, and then it would be run over again. No one seemed to care. And there was nothing I could think of to do, despite what I was feeling. So for all practical purposes, I also did not care. And so it died a slow death. Now to my introduction. I'm Celia. I'm very glad to be giving this talk. And the things that I'm interested in are scripture, theology arising from place, and in particular, Indigenous theologies and Indigenous-led Christianity in Australia. The desert, and the signs of the times, really. So what's happening now in our culture and times, and seeing how all those things speak into that. And I've written this talk as a sort of bricolage, or a series of pictures or points or stories in different forms, and they are all connected, I hope. But what I would suggest you do while you listen to it is to notice what is most strong for you in it, either something you really like or something you feel fierce disagreement with. And if you could jot those down, there'll be some times for reflection and discussion later, and those will found that. If there's things you just find meh, ignore them, they're not for you. And just to note that much of this talk is the Judeo-Christian and Western imaginaries of the desert. And First Nations ideas of the desert are disruptive to this, and I will touch on that at the end. And to start with, a quote from Ursula Le Guin. Copernicus told us that the earth was not the centre. Darwin told us that man is not the centre. If we listen to the anthropologists, we might hear them telling us, with appropriate indirectness, that the white West is not the centre. The centre of the world is a bluff on the Klamath River, a rock in Mecca, a hole in the ground in Greece. Nowhere, its circumference everywhere. Perhaps the utopist should heed this unsettling news at last. Perhaps the utopist would do well to lose the plan, throw away the map, get off the motorcycle, put on a very strange-looking hat, bark sharply 3 times and trot off, looking thin, yellow and dingy across the desert and up into the digger pines. And in a very Alice Springs happening, I first came across this quote on an anarchist poster that someone had stuck up on a wall in the city here, and it had no attribution, and it took me a while to figure out that it was written by Ursula Le Guin. To me, it captures well the feel of our times, like there are multiple centres, each with a worldview that is firmly held and also completely inconsistent with all the others. And so we find ourselves in these seemingly intractable disputes in groups, across generations, in churches, across societies, and we're struggling to hold together. Perhaps if we pause the fighting and bark sharply 3 times and trot off looking thin, yellow and dingy across the desert, we may find another way to look at all this. And now to my next bit of my bricolage, and this is a dream. Dreams matter a lot in deserts, and this is a dream that I had. And it was from a time when I'd become ill and I was falling out of my life as I knew it. I'd spent maybe 5 years at that point futilely trying to get fixed in every way I could think about, using every sort of help I could find. And I had this dream. And in the dream, I was living wild in some sort of entirely uncultivated landscape. There was danger from people who were likely to fly in and attack from above. I'd figured out how to move around, sheltering under various trees and in the odd abandoned building, making sure I couldn't be seen from on high. And I'd learned to find food there. And I had this strange pride in my ability to survive. And just a note, this dream sounds a little like a teen apocalypse novel, Hunger Games in particular. That's probably exactly so, but nonetheless, such it was. In my dream, there came a call that I and people like me were going to be saved. We all had to gather together on an elevated platform, and help would arrive from on high and take us back to civilization. And it was tempting because the life I was living was hard and solitary. And I thought about it, but I knew in that dream way that it was extremely dangerous, all of us gathering together on that platform exposed to the sky. And I was not at all sure that the rescue was in fact for good. And so I stayed living as I was. And now, next part, and this is on order versus the desert in Hebrew scriptures. Genesis describes God creating the world out of chaos by repeatedly dividing into binaries that hold to give a stable order. So night from day, sky from earth, sea from land. When those boundaries break, say in the story of Noah, when the sea rises and the earth's open and the sky opens and water comes down and swamps the land, the return to chaos is terrifying. In our time, we can talk as though the highest good is to be a people without binaries or limits, and the word tolerant is often used here, but this is always a lie. Binaries and limits create order, and order is necessary for life. And when order collapses, the strong prey on the weak. There's looting, rape, murder, and war, and wars and revolutions are terrifying times. Less dramatically, our everyday lives abound in order. A marriage, a private home, workplaces, degrees and expertise, a neighbourhood. These are all forms of order, and they're held together by laws, which is only the smallest part of it, but actually by unwritten rules and norms and honour-shame systems. Any sort of group or gathering can only exist because of a myriad of rules, again, mostly unwritten, but enforced just the same. And these become visible as soon as they're breached. So a neo-Nazi in the pulpit, pedophile in the kids' class, but also any true outsider who comes inside will come up against them over and over and over again. If we really think we have no limits, we are likely to be exactly the sort of people this order is working for. That is to say, we are insiders. And the anthropologist David Graeber gives an example that's been really helpful for me in thinking about this. And he talks about his American university library at the time, where he just waltzed in and out with his library card. But he says if you don't have a card and you try and enter in, very quickly, men in uniforms with guns will manifest to make sure you can't. In scripture, the desert is a sort of opposite to the good order of civilization. The prophet Isaiah describes Edom, the kingdom of Edom, becoming corrupt, and the judgment of God turning the once fruitful civilization into a desert. And for Bible nerds, Edom was the land of the descendants of Esau, the unchosen son, who was hairy and liked to hunt outdoors. And Isaiah's description gives us a really vivid sense of what the imaginary of becoming a desert meant. I'm just going to read it for you now, and I've given it to you in the King James Version because I think it's particularly beautiful. And this is the second half of Isaiah 34. From generation to generation it shall lie waste. None shall pass through it forever and ever. But the cormorant and the bittern shall possess it. The owl also and the raven shall dwell in it. And he's God here, shall stretch out upon it the line of confusion and the stones of emptiness. They shall call the nobles thereof to the kingdom, but none shall be there. And all her princes shall be nothing. And thorns shall come up in her palaces, nettles and brambles in the fortresses thereof. And it shall be an habitation of dragons and a court for owls. The wild beasts of the desert shall also meet with the wild beasts of the island. The satyr shall cry to his fellow. Lilith, the screech owl, also shall rest there and find for herself a place of rest. There shall the great owl make her nest and lay and hatch and gather under her shadow. There shall the vultures also be gathered, every one with her mate. Seek ye out of the book of the Lord and read. No one of these shall fail. None shall want her mate. For my mouth it hath commanded, and his spirit it hath gathered them. And he hath cast the lot for them, and his hand hath divided it unto them by line. They shall possess it forever. From generation to generation shall they dwell therein. And so we see here, instead of order, there is the line of confusion and the stones of emptiness, which I love as an expression. The system of human authority has collapsed. Instead of crops, there's the cursed thorns and thistles from Genesis 3. Instead of buildings, there are ruins. Instead of civilization, there is wildness. Instead of clean animals that are useful for being sacrificed and for food and for farm labour, we meet all manner of unclean and strange and, to me, delightful creatures. The satyr is a goat demon and is not unconnected to the sin-bearing scapegoat wandering around the desert from the Day of Atonement. Lilith is also a demon, and she's sort of a dark counter to Eve, and there's a lot of tales in the folklore about Lilith. There are unclean birds and wild beasts, and this most intriguing pair of troubled things. And I really like these. I've spent a lot of time thinking about these. And so this is just a verse close up from the passage we've just read. And when it says it shall be a court for a habitation of dragons and a court for owls, the word is actually tannin and then yana. And you can see the meanings there, but tannin's essentially Leviathan, the sea serpent. Sometimes when I'm in the desert, I think of the tannin as the dingoes, though there's also sort of these stories, and perhaps in remote waterholes around here, there are large serpents coiled up in the bottom. And yana means what you see there, but this idea of a bird with a doleful call, like desolate creature. The tannin are powerful and frightening, and the yana are desolate. But I had an owl go for my head here early in the morning when I was walking the labyrinth. So the yana can be plenty disconcerting as well. And these things that haunt deserts are genuinely threatening. And yet, in this Isaiah passage, the desert doesn't sound all bad. These strange creatures can rest unthreatened by humans. They build nests. They each have a mate, and they bring up their young. And now to the next part of this mosaic of a talk, and I'm going to read to you from Helen Waddell's book on the Desert Fathers and Mothers, and just a little bit complicated who this is about. So this is St. Jerome, and he's writing about St. Paul, who's the first desert hermit. But in his story, he describes Antony, who became known as the first desert father, wandering off to find St. Paul. And I'm actually going to read to you about Antony. And we meet Antony. He's just had an encounter with a hippo centaur, and he continues on his way. And now I'm quoting from St. Jerome in translation. Nor was it long till in a rocky alley he saw a dwarfish figure of no great size, its nostrils joined together, and its forehead bristling with horns. The lower part of its body ended in goat's feet. Unshaken by the sight, Antony, like a good soldier, caught up the shield of faith and the buckler of hope. The creature thus described, however, made to offer him dates as tokens of peace, and perceiving this, Antony hastened his step, and asking him who he might be, had this reply: "Mortal am I, and one of the dwellers in the desert, whom the heathen worship, astray in diverse error, calling us fauns and satyrs and incubi. I come on an embassy from my tribe. We pray thee that thou wouldst entreat for us our common God, who did come, we know, for the world's salvation, and his sound hath gone forth over all the earth." Hearing him speak thus, the old wayfarer let his tears run down. He was 90 at this time. Tears that sprung from the mighty joy that was in his heart. For he rejoiced for Christ's glory and the fall of Satan, marvelling that he could understand his discourse, and striking the ground with his staff. "Woe to thee, Alexandria," he cried, "who dost worship monsters in room of God. Woe to thee, harlot city, in whom the demons of all the earth have flowed together. What hast thou now to say?" The beasts speak Christ, and thou dost worship monsters in room of God. He had not yet left speaking when the frisky creature made off as if on wings. And then pretty endearingly, Jerome goes on to describe how later another being of this type was brought alive to Alexandria and died and was preserved in salt, and the corpse was shown to people. And he's trying to convince us that we should in fact believe this story as he's written it. So far, so many binaries, right? So Christ and Satan, order and chaos, civilization and ruin, the city and the desert, clean and unclean, the saint and the satyr, inside and outside. And there's more. And these boundaries provide the foundation, or they underpin the Day of Atonement, the annual ritual for the cleansing of the tabernacle and then the temple in Hebrew scripture. And the instructions for the Day of Atonement set up a sort of geography of holiness. And on the left here is a diagram of the tabernacle, and the most holy location, or the most holy place, is labelled the Holy of Holies here, but sometimes it's called the most holy place. And then the holy place, or the rest of the inside, is the next most holy, and then the boundaries of the whole thing are the next most holy. And it's like the desert outside the whole camp. So on the right is an imaginary picture of what the Israelite camp might have looked like. The desert outside is like an opposite to the most holy place, so the least holy place. And as the Torah sets it all up, on the Day of Atonement, 2 goats are selected and then lots are cast. And Aaron, who is the high priest, so he is the most holy man, is ordered to do this. And this is just reading from Leviticus 16. Aaron shall bring the goat whose lot falls to the Lord and sacrifice it for a sin offering. But the goat chosen by lot as the scapegoat shall be presented alive before the Lord to be used for making atonement by sending it into the wilderness as a scapegoat. And then we read about how the goat whose lot falls to the Lord is sacrificed, and its blood is sprinkled in various places to cleanse. And then it continues like this. When Aaron has finished making atonement for the most holy place, the tent of meeting and the altar, he shall bring forward the live goat. He is to lay both hands on the head of the live goat and confess over it all the wickedness and rebellion of the Israelites, all their sins, and put them on the goat's head. He shall send the goat away into the wilderness in the care of someone appointed for the task. The goat will carry on itself all their sins to a remote place, and the man shall release it in the wilderness. And so the holy places are clean again, as the wickedness, rebellion, and sins of the people have been sent out to the desert with the goat. Now, if you look at this story from the perspective of the 2 goats, to me, it seems a better gig, all things considered, to be the scapegoat, the goat whose lot does not fall to the Lord. The scapegoat is driven out to keep the inside nice and clean. It's like rubbish or sewage. We flush it away or throw it out and then it's gone. Only, as become painfully apparent in our late modern times, it isn't gone. There's much that is troubling that we might like to drive out of our good order so we don't have to deal with it, but it doesn't quite work like that. For a start, any binary requires the opposite for its own identity. So the 2 things in a binary are irrevocably connected. But also, and paradoxically, the process of driving something out can strengthen our connection to it. Avery Gordon, the sociologist, would say that what we spend our effort avoiding or driving out haunts us. And a quote from her, "What's distinctive about haunting is that it is an animated state in which a repressed or unresolved social violence is making itself known, sometimes very directly, sometimes more obliquely." King Herod had secured power, upholding the good order of his day. The hairy cloaked desert dweller John the Baptist threatens his goodness by critiquing his marriage to his brother's wife, Herodias. So Herod had him locked up, but Herod likes John, finds him strangely fascinating, so he also slips away to hear him. And this is from Mark 17. Oh, it's actually from Mark 7, sorry. So Herodias nursed a grudge against John and wanted to kill him, but she was not able to because Herod feared John and protected him, knowing him to be a righteous and holy man. When Herod heard John, he was greatly puzzled, yet he liked to listen to him. Herod ends up beheading this fascinating but disturbing man to save face. This abjectly fails to end Herod's preoccupation with John. Later, when Herod hears rumours about Jesus, his first reaction is, John, whom I beheaded, has been raised from the dead, because Herod is haunted by John. And we're going to have a pause in this talk now to stay with any of that's been interesting to you, but I'm also going to read you a quote now, and there are some particular questions that I'm going to leave up as a slide, and there'll be a couple of minutes just to stay with that, and then we'll start up again. And the quote is from Rowan Williams, and it goes like this. Wittgenstein said that the happy person and the unhappy person inhabit different worlds, and most of us know from experience that happiness can be a curiously exclusive thing. The couple happily in love may be full of concern and goodwill for the less happy, may want to draw others into their happiness, but to the truly unhappy they speak a foreign language. The more their fulfillment is manifest, the more cruel and unbridgeable seems the gulf between them and the wretched, the tormented, the failed. A church which sets great store by tangible fulfillment, spiritual security, hope satisfied, is bound to be like this. A warm little house on an enormous black moor, inside warm and content, outside weeping and loss, intensified by the very presence of the unattainable little haven. And my questions are up here, and I'll disappear now, and I'll see you again in a couple of minutes. Now to the next part of this talk. You can see the city. One view of the city, which I always do when I go back because it's so different to here, is to stand in the middle of it and look up at the tall buildings. The city looks quite different from the desert. Jesus was sent into the wilderness at the start of his ministry. He met the devil there, as you might expect from the Isaiah reading, and he was shown what the city looked like from the desert. It looked powerful and splendid, and it looked as though it was run by the devil. And quote from Luke, The devil led him up to a high place and showed him in an instant all the kingdoms of the world. And he said to him, I will give you all their authority and splendor. It has been given to me, and I can give it to anyone I want to. If you worship me, it will all be yours. Jesus came out of the desert with a marked outsider perspective. His first sermon is met with rapt approval, right up to the point where he cites the prophets Elijah and Elisha having been sent to two outsiders, a foreign widow and a foreign general. This is so intensely irritating that people try to drive him off a cliff. Jesus also has a tendency to use strange outsider images, comparing himself to, say, a thief coming to break in. He is so disruptive to the good order that after 3 years of this sort of thing, those in power come together to save it by killing him for the sake of the nation, as the high priest puts it. You could say God was driven out by the high priest, bearing the sins, rebellion, and wickedness of the people, and subverting all the binaries as he went. And now to my next point, next part of this talk. The good order of the city doesn't look so good from the desert. Cattle, buffle grass, and extinctions are what happens when Western reason and greed meet the desert landscapes. And visitors to Central Australia here see a stirring wildness, but it isn't what it was. Cattle came here and they polluted waterholes, and their hooves destroyed the surface of the soil, and much plant and animal life and human life was lost because of that. The topsoil became loose and it blew away in dust storms, started to blow away in dust storms, and buffle grass, and this picture's buffle grass, was introduced as the solution. And it does hold the earth down, and it also gets the cattle through dry times. And it isn't particularly good feed, but it does the job. However, as seems so often the case, we create a problem and we introduce a species to solve the problem, and that becomes the next problem. And buffle is taking over the landscape here. Where there was a vibrant diversity of plants and flowers, now there is buffle stretching to the horizon. It is a boring, life-suppressing monoculture. It also burns hot, and fires that used to renew the landscape now threaten to destroy it. The pure reason, the cunning win-win plan that seems so sensible in the logic of the city, is eventually seen for what it is in the desert. And this next slide has a picture that I really like, a Goya, and it's called The Sleep of Reason Produces Monsters, and it's sort of a dark counterpart to Jacob's Ladder. And I think what I've been describing is what G.K. Chesterton would describe as the combination of a logical completeness and a spiritual contraction. I'm just going to read you now this quote from him. There is such a thing as a narrow universality. There is such a thing as a small and cramped eternity. You may see it in many modern religions. Now, speaking quite externally and empirically, we may say that the strongest and most unmistakable mark of madness is this combination between a logical completeness and a spiritual contraction. The lunatic's theory explains a large number of things, but it does not explain them in a large way. I mean that if you or I were dealing with a mind that was growing morbid, we should be chiefly concerned not so much to give it arguments as to give it air, to convince it that there was something cleaner and cooler outside the suffocation of a single argument. Now to my next point. People who spend time in deserts become a bit like deserts. And Tyson Yunkaporta writes about this, I'll put myself down here so you can read it, in his book, Sand Talk, How Indigenous Thinking Can Save the World. And he says this: in the home language of my family, there's no word for culture. There is a phrase that approximates that concept, but the meaning is untranslatable into English. If you look at the direct translation of each word, the meaning comes out as being like our place. Being in profound relation to place changes everything about you: your voice, your smell, your walk, your morality. Hairy cloaked prophets like Elijah and John the Baptist spent a lot of time in deserts, and they were both straight speaking, courageous, unbending sort of blokes who said spiky true things. If Tyson Yunkaporta is right, it is an interesting question as to what becoming like our place or being like our place means for those of us who live in cities. And if you do become like the desert, you are unlikely to fit smoothly in the city. Or as Les Murray wrote about it, in the huge spaces of the outback, ordinary souls expand into splendid and often innocent grotesquerie, which the cramping of urban surrounds might transmute into ugly, even dangerous forms. Job in the Bible, in the Old Testament, in Hebrew scripture, is accosted by small-minded men saying eminently reasonable things as he sits unravelling on the ash heap outside the camp. And well might he describe himself as a brother of Tannin and a companion of Yanna. It is the wild things shown to him by a wild God that save him in the end. And when he returns to the good order, and he does return to the good order, he changes it, giving his daughters an inheritance along with his sons. The desert perspective is by definition an outsider perspective, and so it will always disrupt our good order. And I remember once listening to a young Aranda woman describing her life. Our systems tend to work more or less for insiders. She was not one. And she talked for over an hour describing the oppressive series of bureaucratic tangles, which made it impossible for her to do anything much at all. The system repeatedly didn't work for the actual reality of her life in ridiculous and self-defeating ways. And she gave many, many examples. And the one I remember most clearly was her having to give up a job she loved if she wanted to care for her nephew because of some arbitrary but immovable rules around housing. And during the course of this speech, she described Malcolm Turnbull, the Prime Minister at the time, as Pharaoh in passing. There is evil everywhere, but the evil in our good order is hidden. A wolf who looks like a wolf does a lot less damage than a wolf in sheep's clothing. The Royal Commissions have shown us that evil was flourishing in the heart of the good order of our churches. Good order can be the most dangerous thing of all. Any dictatorship, Nazi Germany, East Germany, now China, Russia, comes in under a leader promising good order, and they deliver it, at least for a while, and use it to crush people. For the ancient Israelites, leaving Egypt and being formed into a free people in the wilderness was a solution to this. So too for the Ukrainian-Polish poet Adam Zagajewski, and he writes this. He says, the trick was to conquer totalitarianism in passing on our way to greater things, lest you become defined by your opposition to it, lest you get enslaved by the fight against it. So many surrounding you did. One of the 20th century's lessons went precisely, sooner or later you become what you fight. So, poetry, art, drinking, affairs, essential inoculations? No, yes. What they did was produce a wildness, a state of constant, incalculable movement of the soul. As long as the soul kept moving, expanding, opening its chambers, speeding up and slowing down like a wise fugitive who knows how to run in large open spaces while evading a sniper lying in wait, it could not be co-opted fully. Were these inoculations enough? Yes, no. We don't have to go to a literal desert, though I found it helps. I think we do need to deliberately place ourselves outside instead of inside in the locations and groups where we are and experience the view from there. This happens inadvertently to many of us at various times and all of us at the end, but it is also something we can deliberately choose to do. And one of the many reasons it is worth doing is that truly new things also come from deserts in the Hebrew scriptural way of seeing it. And this is a quote from later in Isaiah, and it's a quote that's, this is a passage that's extremely meaningful to me for the things I do, the many things I do here, and I'm sure it's familiar to you, but I'm going to read it to you in any case. And it goes like this. See, I am doing a new thing. Now it springs up. Do you not perceive it? I am making a way in the wilderness and streams in the wasteland. The wild animals honour me, the tannin and the yanna, because I provide water in the wilderness and streams in the wasteland, to give drink to my people, my chosen, the people I formed for myself, that they may proclaim my praise. There is a good order here, and in the similar passages in Isaiah about new life coming in deserts, here we have a stream flowing between its banks, presumably. People are back. They're acting in to a common purpose in praising God. And to my delight, the tannin and the yanna have a place in it. If we want to find a way forward among repeated and intractable disputes, the solution may be found by stepping away from both paradigms altogether to see if we can see the world from a different point of view. There will likely be bewilderment for a time, maybe a very long time, but there is also the chance of real newness. This is not the same thing as solving disputes by eliminating binaries altogether. That is no solution. That is the wolf in sheep's clothing, the most dangerous of all. There is evil. There are enemies. This world has much that will degrade and destroy. We need walls and limits, and to clearly name things as they are. Pretending everything is good doesn't make everything good. It's a well-worn totalitarian trick to ensure the current good order is unchallengeable and to silence critique, dissent, and difference. Some of the most frightening people I have met believe that they are loving and inclusive, and that really the way they see it is the way all loving people see it. They find any difference of view to their own so unimaginable that their response is to eliminate it and the bearers of it from their spaces altogether. Violence disguised as love is a frightening thing. Which brings me now to First Nations perspectives on deserts, which completely troubles everything I've been saying. First Nations people have suffered greatly under a settler colonial society that believed it was doing it for their own good. And this imaginary of the desert I've been exploring doesn't quite hold in Australia. And this is a quote of an Eric Michaels from a book by Deborah Bird Rose. And he says, she writes, much of the continent in settler terms is remote, but for those Aboriginal people who live in these remote areas, where they are is the centre. As Eric Michaels pointed out, from the perspective of the Tanami region of the Western Northern Territory, Canberra is a very remote place indeed. In Hebrew scripture, deserts are places of lack, often requiring miraculous intervention to survive. And they're places where people live only for a time, often all the while longing for the promised land, which is somewhere else. The Anangu from the APY lands have lived in deserts forever. They are not barren places of chaos for them. They are home, and they abound in order. And back to Ursula Le Guin, who's speaking about America, but same here. What the whites perceived as a wilderness to be tamed was in fact better known to human beings than it has ever been since, known and named. Every hill, every valley, creek, canyon, gulch, gully, draw, point, cliff, bluff, beach, bend, good-sized boulder, and tree of any character had its name, its place in the order of things. An order was perceived of which the invaders were entirely ignorant. You might say the tannin here was the white fellas who came in and lied and murdered and destroyed. What to settler society was law and order, say Mounted Constable George Murray, who came back as a returned Anzac and was a policeman out west of here. He ended up perpetuating the Coniston massacre, in which probably over 70 people were killed in the name of law and order in the time. And this happened in the 1920s, late 1920s, and is very alive still to the people living in those areas. And so there's an inquest currently underway, which is Constable Zachary Rolfe shot and killed Kumanjai Walker in the course of a policing operation out in Yuendumu. And it's a complicated inquest, and it's 3 months of hearings. It's being examined from many points of view. But for many of the people in Yuendumu, they see it as exactly the same story, where law and order has shot and killed. And I've been following the Rolfe inquest quite closely. It's all online, so you can read it. But it's interested me the language that's being used, particularly in the young police and their private communications, is all the language we've been looking at a little bit in this talk. So Zachary Rolfe sent a text saying that he thought Alice Springs was the Wild West and there were all rules in this job. And a couple of days ago, there was some cross-examination where a friend of Zachary Rolfe sent a text message to him warning him not to talk to senior police just after the shooting. And he said, the message said, "Don't trust these snake Fs." And so these concepts are still live and shaping people's lives in very dramatic ways and troubling ways in this place now at this time. Insiders can talk lightly about going beyond binaries, but this can look quite different from the outside. Abandoning a concept of truth, say, just at the moment when First Nations peoples are gaining traction for truth-telling, might not be entirely helpful. And wanted to show you this picture. These are two paintings by a man who's died now called Andrew Jabberjarry Spencer. I think he was a genius. He was a devout Lutheran. He was a Walpurgis elder, very highly regarded. He worked across the medical and legal systems, and he was also an Unkri, so a traditional healer in those ways. And he'd had gone really wrong in his early life and been jailed for murder. And when he came out, he wanted to help young people not make the mistakes he had and find a better way. And these are two paintings that he's painted to teach the younger people in his communities. And if you can see, they're both replete with binaries. So the one on the left has the way of the eagle and the way of the crow. And the way of the eagle is the good way, and the way of the crow is the bad way that leads to the death, dramatically drawn at the top there. And the one at the right has two snakes. His jukapa, his dreaming, was the snake, and the way of the red snake is the troubled way there, and the way of the black snake is the good way. So it's subverting our binaries, but it's binaries nonetheless. And my conclusion, and back to the settler colonial perspective, from our perspective, the wilds are genuinely dangerous. The demons are demons. A brown snake can and will kill you. And out there is isolation and madness, and you can wander off into the digger pines and never come back. We need order to live, but order itself is dangerous, and so we need the wilds. It is existentially extremely painful to look at our good order from outside and realise it isn't so good after all. But in an era where good order could be the greatest danger of all, it may be the task of our times. And so now we're going to split into small groups, and I hope this talk's been somewhat of a provocation. There's a lot of spiky things in it. And again, please feel free to disagree with any or all of it. I like arguing, but it's also been set up for that. And there's some questions to take into the groups. And if you could have the discussion, and then someone from the group bring back the one or two strongest points to the plenary, and taking a maximum of 2 minutes so we can all get a sense of where all the groups have been in this time. Thank you very much for having me.